I couldn't help but think is all you guys are coming noisily down the hall and in here and so forth. In the Army, we have a couple of words that we use. One of them is attention, and everybody has to shut up. And the other one is at ease, and you gotta stand still. But we wouldn't want to do that. Would we? Oh, man. Well, what I've got here is a film of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was developed by the National Park Service historians, and it was created in 1991, which was 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, first thing I wanted to ask you, anybody, if you know where Pearl Harbor is, I'd like to know if you know. And now where? Oh, there. That. Tell me, where is Pearl Harbor?
It's on the coast of Hawaii.
Where?
It's on the coast of Hawaii.
On the coast of Hawaii. That's as good as you can get. Okay. Well, Hawaii was not a state when I first went there in 1940. These are the islands. And this is the island where Pearl Harbor is located. And I intended to pack this up someplace, but that ought to do it. I wanted to point out something to you. That Pearl Harbor was a target, all right, as it says on this tape. It's called Target Pearl Harbor. But they weren't really after Pearl Harbor. And it's in Hawaii, and they weren't really after Hawaii. They were after certain ships that were in Hawaii, namely aircraft carriers. Why aircraft carriers? Because on the aircraft carriers you have aircraft. Those aircraft have guns and bombs and stuff. And so what they were after was they came in over this is where the Army was located. That's the Army, major Army unit there. And this little place here, they came in at the level, at sea level, they went over the land and up over this mountain, right down on the Army Air Force place where they had the pursuit planes. Pursuit planes, they're the ones that do all that stuff and shoot other people down. That's differentiated from bombers. So they went there first, and then down to Pearl Harbor. Well, this is Pearl Harbor. This is about where I was. That's Hickam Field. Hickam Field was an Army air base. All the airplanes belonged to the Army, those days, not the Air Force. So then they wanted to get them. They weren't really much interested in Hickam Field. Hickam Field had a whole lot of bombers. Well, you can't fight fighters with bombers. You can only fight invaders if somebody landed from a ship and walked ashore. Then they mounted something. You go out and bomb a ship, but you can't bomb, they can't fight. So then, oh yeah, I want to say, you think of Hawaii, you don't know how much land there is here. Well, it just so happens that there are 660 square miles. And I realize that square miles don't mean much to you either. But to go all the way around the island like this, you can't get here because that's too rough. You can't get a car there. You could come down through here. 102 miles. Well, it's 65 miles to Huntsville. So if you divide 100 miles in two, that's only 50 miles, right? So it's about 40 miles from here to here. Here it's about 75 miles, something like that. So it's not a very big place. And I wanted you to be aware, in 1902, the Armed Forces of the United States first went to Hawaii. Hawaii became a territory of the United States along about that time. And I lived in one of their houses that they built in 1902 or 1904, and it was all full of termites. That was years later, a long time. But anyway, I wanted to show you, give you an idea of the military locations. Well, in the first place, here's Pearl Harbor. I pointed out to you that there was the Army base way up to the north. And then this is army. This is a hospital. This is an army. This is where I was. And it was exactly 3 miles from here to Pearl Harbor. Hickam Field was even closer, 2 miles. And that's where I was when the attack took place. But the funny part of it is that the first attack made by the Japanese at that time was not on Pearl Harbor. It was on a Marine Corps, they call them Marine Corps Air Facility, meaning that's a place where airplanes are stored, and that's because they had, what do I call them, PBYs. They were not spy planes, but observation planes, but they were saving them, and that'll all come out in the film. So that was the first place destroyed by the Japanese airplanes. So then they came back to, well, the rest of them got to Pearl Harbor. So I just thought, oh yeah, and this was Army, and that was Army, and there was Army based down here, and it was all over the place. Well, almost all over. That's an exaggeration. Good place to work. Right? I don't like to bend over. Might not stand up. But I wanted to start out slowly, not so slowly, to tell you about what was the situation in the world at the time prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, when I was in 8th grade, I did a project once which I thought was pretty cute, so I'll tell you about it. There was a man named Hindenburg, a general from World War I, and he was trying to be the president of Germany. Well, Hitler, you've heard the name Hitler, he, Nazis, so-called National Socialists, he wanted to run the affairs in Germany. So about that time, they had asked Hindenburg to be the president of Germany. And when I made this little project in 8th grade, I had a booklet, and I found a paper someplace where Hindenburg's picture was in it, but it was primarily his head. So I cut off his neck and cut out that picture, and I put that on the front of my booklet, and I called that the head of Germany. Now, wasn't that pretty cute? Huh? Say yes.
Yes.
So that's when I first became aware of troubles in the world. Well, when I was also in 8th going into 9th grade, the Italians, they also had a Nazi party of sorts. They called them fascists. And so Mussolini wanted to get territory in Africa. The other countries of Europe had territory in Africa. Colonies, you might call it. So he attacked Ethiopia, where there was a king who tried his darndest at the United Nations at that time to have some action taken to defend him against the Italians, but nobody would help. And so that was bad news. And then at that same time, the Japanese were already in Asia, a place called Manchuria, which they called Manchukuo. And they put their own government in there. But they were then had troops just north of China. In 1932, they started a war with China, Japanese that is. Started a war with China, and it was the longest lasting war ever in the history of the world at that time. Well, practically the history of the world, in modern times anyway. And that went on and on and on, and we, the United States people, President Roosevelt objected to that very much. And yet, he couldn't do much because the people in the United States were in a period of anti-involvement. There was another word for it, I can't think of it. But when I was in high school, a group was running around trying to get all the young men in high school to sign up to refuse to go into the armed forces if they ever were called upon. My father said, "Don't you do that?" I said, "I have no intention of doing it. Don't sign it, that is." In any event, then, along about 1935, I went to sleep in class one time, thinking putting me to sleep. But anyway, the Spanish people in Spain, which is in Europe, they had a civil war. And the Germans involved themselves in that, and also the Russians. So it was a pretty nasty time. And then, in in 1939, the Germans had built themselves up and they got rid of Hindenburg and Hitler would run everything. So first they took over some land where German people lived in Czechoslovakia, and they did that. And then the Austrian people are Germanic. They're Germans too, have been forever. And so they had an affair with that, and Austria joined with the Germans. So then, in September the 2nd, 1939, the German Army and Air Force attacked Poland. That's, what do they call that? Blitzkrieg, which means Krieg means war in German, and Blitz is what it means, is fast. Lightning war, basically. So I was then getting ready to go to school, college, and I was, well, when I was in 11th grade, I think it was, in history class that I was in, and I predicted then that I knew where I would be sometime between the time I was 20 and 25. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came, it was 1 month past my 23rd birthday, so I did that pretty well on the head. But I was quite upset with the situation in the world, so I stopped my tutoring, and I fooled around for a while. I worked, of course, but I decided, well, I'll go in the Army, and maybe I'll live through it, get a little on the ball, learn what I need to learn. Maybe I'll be alive when the war is over, which I expected to come. So what I did was to enlist at that time, and since I was a motorcycle rider, I had read a poem one time about the message to Garcia and getting through with the message, and I had saw all the seen. No, I didn't see. I heard them on the radio. Stories about World War I. They drowned us in that stuff. Like after World War II, that's the only kind of movies we had. Constant showing all the war. And so I could see myself riding a motorcycle and taking the message to somebody and being shot at in shell holes and all that kind of stuff. But the only place I could get out of the sergeant that had motorcycles in the Army was in Hawaii. I said, well, send me to Hawaii. So that's how I got there. And later, well, when I got to get off the ship, I was carrying my barracks bag and standing up straight. I'm a pretty good big fella, and the military police captain and his sergeant were at the ship, and they said, so I went over and they said, we'd like you to consider going into this MP company. Well, that's what I was there for, because I knew they had motorcycles. I was a long way to being a policeman, but anyway, I went with it and joined that unit. But then I found out what they did and so forth, and I decided I didn't tell them I could ride a motorcycle. So I went to school and lucked out. I ended up at the university and went to police, so I got acquainted with certain people we're going to talk about a little later, and which was very interesting. So I had some police training. So then during the war, when it first started, I didn't have to pull any guard duty or KP or anything like that, because I was being a military policeman. We used to escort the civil police, and then we had to marshal the law. So then the aftermath of the attack will come a little later. I want you to listen carefully. I was going to show you how far Hawaii is, way out in the Pacific Ocean. See, here's the United States, and there's Hawaii, long way out. Midway is an important spot, and that's way out about in here. Later, Midway was it was the most important battle of the Pacific War. But I'd like to show you some of this before you all go to sleep on it. And the forces, so it was really a failure, total failure. In five months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese got fooling around with, they had, like they said, they had 6 aircraft carriers, and they wanted to pick up the island of the Midway, which is another 1,500 miles out in the Pacific beyond Hawaii. And so they attacked, but Admiral Nimitz then sent his people out, and they didn't know for sure where the Japanese were going to go, but they met them. There's a wonderful movie about the Battle of the Midway. And at that battle, 4 of their aircraft carriers were lost. Plus, the biggest battleship in the world was lost. A whole lot of other ships were lost, and a whole raft of airplanes. And so there they were. And at that time of that battle, that was the most important battle in the Pacific of the entire World War II, because the Japanese were already doomed at that time. They just did not have anything. They just could not take it, and they started going backwards right there. Oh, we gotta go.
That's all right. We can take a few more minutes. Would you tell the boys and girls where you were and what it was like when it happened, when you heard the...
Well, I was in bed. I worked 12 hours that night. Went to bed 5 o'clock in the morning, and then they dropped the bombs on Pearl Harbor. It was like an earthquake. I mean, it was a noise. I hopped out of bed, jumped into my combat uniform with a steel helmet and so on, and fell out and waiting for somebody to give me some orders. Just like the rest of them, nobody there to give orders. So then First Sergeant came along. He made us go back into our pretty uniform that we'd worn the night before, and shiny leather and all that kind of stuff, and put us back on the post where we were the night before, which was 5 miles further down the road away from Pearl Harbor, in the middle of Honolulu, the city of 300,000 people there on Oahu. And so the airplanes were flying over Honolulu too, and they dropped a couple of bombs near me, but I was hiding behind a coconut tree, palm tree, and I didn't see that because I couldn't hit it. But they did kill a poor Chinaman behind I was in the YMCA. The YMCA was because that was the collecting point for members of the armed forces, and our job was to get them and transport it back to their post, whether it was 25 miles to Schofield or 8 miles, 10 miles to Pearl Harbor to the field and so forth. But luckily, I lived through that, 3 more wars after that, and I don't have time to tell you the whole stuff. But I did meet the man that led the air attack in Pearl Harbor. Was a friend of the chief of police. I knew the chief of police, and so this man named Uchida was the commander of the Japanese Navy, and he became a Christian, he said, and he wanted to present a Bible to the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, mostly sailors and so on. And so we had a meeting one day, and there was Billy Graham, and they had met this man in Tokyo during the crusade, and the chief of police was also there. So then they came back 3 months later, and we met him again, and went to a church to have this Bible presented. And the Bible was presented to the chief of police by the Pearl Harbor survivors. Chief of police handed it to Billy Graham, who handed it to the Pearl Harbor survivors. They were in church, but they never took off their caps. It bothered me a little bit. I was invited to be there. Two of us outsiders were there and watched this thing. But anyway, then when I went back in 1991 for the 50th anniversary of the attack, they had a display at a bank in Honolulu with all the stuff that Pearl Harbor survivors had, this and that and the other thing, like they put in such displays. And right in the middle was that Bible from Commander Uchida. And so I met him twice. And I'm the only man I know that was a soldier when the war started there in Hawaii who got to meet the man that led the attack. And then later, several years later, Admiral Nimitz attended a maneuver, exercise we had in California. They called it an atomic exercise. But Admiral Nimitz was there as retired, and little Hull, ex-private first class comeback, was able to shake hands with that 5-star admiral. we had a reception where we had a wine and I got amazing. And yet, that's the way it goes. You never know where you're gonna be, or what you're gonna do, or what's gonna happen. And I could be here till tomorrow this time, I'm still not getting through. So I'll give up now, let you guys talk. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I wanted to tell you about one. There were a set of twins. One was a soldier in my unit, another was a sailor on the West Virginia. And unfortunately, the fellow, and the reason I got to see that sailor, he was down visiting his brother in my unit area, wearing his sailor suit. And the first sergeant came along and said, "Cromwell, what are you doing in that sailor suit?" Cromwell, no, what's wrong with you, mister? But then, a minute or so later, his brother came out of the barracks with his army uniform on. The first sergeant realized these two guys, twins, fine young men, and they looked just alike. And but anyway, the sailor brother got killed on the West Virginia. That old man was a funny-looking hat on him that was talking to the fellow with the mustache. He, of course, he was a survivor. This was in 1991 that picture was taken. I saw him several times, talked to him once. But there's great sadness. I was going to tell a joke when I first came in. You're supposed to tell a joke when you start talking. Well, I didn't, because the only joke I knew was a joke about the first sergeant giving the sick a hard time for not being in an army uniform. You guys get a chance.
Let's come back. We thank you so much. Do you have a question, Ms. Britt? Ms. Britt, would you have a question?
Pleasure.